My family cheered when the lawyer announced their millions at my grandfather's will reading. They were already spending the money in their heads celebrating the death of the man who built our family. When my turn came, I did not receive a check. I received a stained yellow envelope. My sister laughed and told me it was probably an application for a homeless shelter. But when I walked out into the rain and dialed the single phone number, hidden inside a deep voice answered with words that would soon destroy their entire world. I have been waiting for your call, Heir. Before I share how I brought my greedy family to their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic relatives a lesson they will never forget. The air inside Attorney Montgomery's high-end Atlanta law office smelled of expensive leather and unearned arrogance. I sat at the far end of the sleek mahogany conference table watching my family barely contain their glee as the lawyer read the final distribution of Grandpa Silas's estate. Grandpa Silas had always been a quiet man running a humble barbershop in South Atlanta, or so they thought. They ignored him for years, only showing up when they needed a quick loan or a holiday photo opportunity. Now they were practically vibrating with greed. Attorney Montgomery cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He announced that Grandma Loretta, my father Calvin, my mother Yvonne, and my sister Desiree would each receive $3 million in liquid assets. The room erupted. Desiree squealed and threw her arms around her husband Connor, a white real estate developer who always looked at my family like we were stepping stones for his career. My parents sighed with profound relief, already calculating how this money would elevate their social standing. Grandma Loretta simply nodded, a smug smile resting on her face. Then Attorney Montgomery turned his attention to me. I am 29 years old, working as a forensic accountant, a job my family views as deeply unimpressive. I waited patiently as the lawyer reached into his leather briefcase. Instead of a thick legal document, he pulled out a simple yellowed envelope and slid it across the polished wood table toward me. It looked completely out of place in this pristine corporate environment. Connor burst into a loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored designer suit, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and tossed it across the table. It fluttered down and landed squarely in my lap. It was the invoice for the extravagant post-funeral catering they had ordered. The total was $2,500. Since you got a piece of trash, you clearly do not need to eat with the elite. Connor sneered, leaning back in his leather chair with overwhelming arrogance. Pay the catering bill, Amina. Your family paying for your state college degree was charity enough. You owe them this much. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his demand, my mother Yvonne leaned over and snatched the half-full crystal champagne glass right out of my hand. Her manicured nails dug into my wrist. Do not embarrass Connor, she hissed, her voice low but laced with absolute venom. He just pulled some major strings to get your sister a highly coveted spot in the local Jack and Jill chapter. They are moving up in the world. You are 29 years old, crunching numbers in a depressing little cubicle, bringing zero prestige to this family. You could not even get into a decent sorority. The absolute least you can do is pay the man and show some gratitude. Desiree flipped her perfect silk hair over her shoulder and sighed dramatically. Honestly, Amina, you should be thanking Connor for even allowing you to attend the reception. We all know you only showed up today hoping Grandpa left you enough cash to upgrade your terrible apartment. Just put the bill on your credit card. I am sure you can pay it off in a few years. Grandma Loretta tapped her cane against the floor, silencing the room with her usual matriarchal authority. She glared at me with pure disdain. You have always been the disappointment of this bloodline, Amina. Take your little envelope and pay the caterers on your way out. Do not ruin this blessed day for the rest of us. I looked at the catering bill resting on my lap. I looked at the yellowed envelope in front of me. I looked at the faces of the people who shared my blood, faces twisted with superiority and malice. For a brief moment, the old Amina, the girl who spent her entire life desperately trying to earn their approval, felt a familiar sting of rejection. But that girl was gone. I slowly picked up the catering bill, folded it into a tiny square, and placed it directly into Connor's half-empty coffee cup. The paper quickly soaked up the dark liquid. I think you can cover your own appetizers, Connor, I said, my voice completely steady. Your sudden wealth should easily cover a few cocktail shrimp. And Mom, you might want to hold off on bragging to your friends just yet. $3 million goes incredibly fast when you are desperately trying to buy class. I picked up the yellowed envelope, pushed my chair back, and walked toward the heavy glass doors. My father shouted something angry behind me, but I did not stop. I stepped out of the freezing air conditioning of the law office and pushed through the lobby doors into the pouring Atlanta rain. I stood under the meager shelter of a building awning, my heart pounding against my ribs, and carefully tore open the top of the old envelope. There was no check inside. There was no letter explaining why my grandfather had seemingly left me with nothing. There was only a cheap prepaid black burner phone and a small yellow sticky note stuck to the back of it. The note contained a single phone number written in my grandfather's distinct, shaky handwriting. My hands trembled, not from the cold rain, but from a sudden surge of adrenaline. I turned on the burner phone. The screen lit up instantly. I dialed the 10 digits from the sticky note and held the plastic device to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring once, twice, 3 times. A click sounded on the other end. A deep, smooth voice spoke before I could even say a word. "I have been waiting for your call, Heir." The voice on the other end of the line was smooth, professional, and entirely calm, despite the heavy rain soaking through my clothes. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, gripping the cheap plastic phone. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper over the sound of the storm. "I am Elias Montgomery," the voice replied. "Your grandfather, Silas, entrusted me with his most private affairs. There is a black vehicle pulling up to your location right now. Get inside, Amina. We have a lot to discuss, and your family has already started making their moves." A sleek black SUV glided through the rain and stopped right in front of me. The rear door swung open automatically. I did not hesitate. The moment I stepped inside, the heavy door pulled shut, sealing away the noise of the city and the stinging insults of my family. The driver did not speak. He simply navigated us away from the law office and merged onto the highway, heading straight toward Buckhead. I stared out the tinted window, clutching the yellowed envelope. My mind raced, trying to understand why my grandfather, a man who spent 40 years sweeping floors and cutting hair in a modest South Atlanta barbershop, would have a secret proxy. The car pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering, unmarked glass skyscraper. The driver escorted me to a private elevator that required a retinal scan to operate. We rode in silence up to the top floor. The elevator doors parted to reveal a sprawling, minimalist office bathed in the glow of the Atlanta skyline. Standing behind a massive marble desk was a sharp-looking man in a tailored charcoal suit. He walked forward and extended his hand. "Welcome to Shadow Creek Holdings, Amina," he said with a warm smile. "I am Elias, and I have been managing your grandfather's true estate for the past 15 years. I shook his hand, completely bewildered. "True estate?" I echoed. Elias motioned for me to sit in a plush leather chair facing the window. He picked up a thick leather-bound portfolio and placed it gently on the desk between us. "Your family thought Silas was just a humble barber," Elias began, leaning back. "They saw a man who worked with his hands and assumed he had no vision. They patronized him, ignored him, and only visited when they needed a quick loan for a new car or a down payment on a house they could not afford. But Silas was a phantom in the real estate world. Every dollar he made in that shop, he quietly reinvested. He bought distressed commercial properties, empty lots and warehouses across the city long before the gentrification boom hit. He built an empire right under their noses." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "How much?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Elias opened the portfolio and turned it toward me. The bottom line figure on the certified banking summary stared back at me. $500 million in a blind trust. It is completely liquid and entirely yours." I stopped breathing. $500 million. I looked from the paper to Elias, trying to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. "Why me?" I asked. "Why leave the rest of them $3 million each and leave me the entire empire?" Elias smiled softly. "Because you are the only one who actually saw him, Amina. When your mother was busy climbing the social ladder and your sister was chasing status, you were the one sitting at his kitchen table every Sunday. You thought you were just helping him balance the books for his barber shop. You did not realize those complex supply chain spreadsheets and expense reports you organized for him for free were actually the coded ledgers of his commercial acquisitions. He watched you use your forensic accounting skills to save him thousands of dollars. He saw your brilliant mind. Most importantly, he saw your loyalty. He knew the money would destroy the rest of them. He knew you were the only one who could handle the power. I sat back, letting the reality wash over me. The family had just humiliated me over a catering bill while I was secretly the sole owner of a $500 million real estate empire. But Elias's expression suddenly grew serious. He tapped a button on his desk, bringing up a series of financial charts on a large wall monitor. "We do not have much time to celebrate," Elias warned. "Your family just inherited $12 million collectively today and they are already throwing it away." I looked at the screen. "What do you mean throwing it away?" Elias pointed to a massive outgoing wire transfer flagged in the system. "Connor, your arrogant brother-in-law has convinced your father, your mother, and your grandmother to pool their entire inheritance. He is launching a massive commercial development project. He calls it a mega project that will elevate the family name, but the truth is, he is leveraging their fresh cash as collateral to secure massive bank loans for his own firm. They blindly trust him because of his background and his connections. They think he is their golden ticket to the Billionaire Boys Club. They have no idea they are walking into a financial slaughterhouse." A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. Even after how they treated me, the thought of Connor manipulating my family using his privilege to drain my grandfather's hard-earned money made me furious. He was using them as a piggy bank while mocking my existence. Just as Elias handed me the formal documents to sign, assuming control of the trust, my personal cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another taunting message from my sister Desiree. Instead, it was an automated email marked urgent from my apartment building's property management company. I opened the message and read the cold, sterile text. It was a formal notice of immediate eviction. The text stated that the building had just been acquired by a new corporate entity, and all month-to-month leases were being terminated without the standard renewal grace period. I had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises, or face forced removal by local law enforcement. My blood boiled. I scrolled to the very bottom of the digital document to find the signature block of the new property ownership group. The logo staring back at me belonged to none other than Connor's real estate development firm. He had not just insulted me at the will reading, he had actively gone out of his way to purchase the very building I lived in, just to throw me out onto the street and prove his absolute dominance over my life. I locked my phone and looked up at Elias, a dangerous new energy coursing through my veins. I gripped the encrypted phone Elias had just handed me and stared at the glowing screen. The eviction notice from Connor's development firm was not just a legal threat, it was an act of war. I looked up at Elias. The shock that had paralyzed me moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold and calculating fury. My grandfather had trusted me with a $500 million empire because he knew I had the spine to protect it. It was time to prove him right. I told Elias to keep the financial monitors running and sprinted toward the private elevator. The black luxury vehicle was waiting for me at the curb. I gave the driver my address on Elm Street and watched the rain streak across the tinted windows as we sped through the Atlanta traffic. My apartment was not a luxury penthouse, but it was my sanctuary. I had worked late nights doing forensic audits to pay for every piece of furniture and every piece of art that reflected my culture and my peace. When the vehicle pulled up to the curb, I saw a large commercial moving truck idling illegally in the fire lane. My heart hammered against my ribs. I bypassed the slow elevator and sprinted up 3 flights of stairs. When I reached my floor, I saw my front door propped wide open with a heavy wooden wedge. 2 burly men in muddy work boots were hauling my velvet green sofa out into the hallway. I pushed past them and stepped into my living room. The sight hit me like a physical blow. Connor was standing in the center of my apartment, running his hands over the lapels of his custom suit and looking around with an expression of utter disgust. Desiree stood right beside him, sipping an iced matcha latte and wearing designer clothes, looking utterly bored as she took a selfie with her phone. Movers were grabbing my clothes, my framed degrees, my books, and tossing them carelessly into thick industrial black trash bags. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Connor turned slowly with a smug and arrogant grin spreading across his face. He looked at me the way he always did, like I was a pest he needed to exterminate to maintain his pristine and elite lifestyle. "Amina," he sighed, using that patronizing tone he reserved exclusively for my family. "You read the email, did you not? My firm officially finalized the acquisition of this miserable little building an hour ago. We are expediting the clearing process. This property is being demolished by the end of the month." "You cannot just throw me out on the street without notice," I fired back, stepping over a trash bag filled with my winter coats. "This is an illegal eviction." Connor laughed, a harsh and dismissive sound. "Please spare me the legal lecture. I have a team of corporate lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. You are on a month-to-month lease in a gentrifying neighborhood. You are a casualty of progress. We are building Legacy Plaza right here on this dirt. It is a massive luxury commercial and residential complex that will completely transform this area. We are bringing in the right demographic, Amina. We are cleaning up the neighborhood." The racial and classist undertones of his words hung heavily in the air. He was talking about erasing my community, and my own sister was standing right there nodding in agreement. Desiree finally lowered her phone and looked at me with deep pity. "Honestly, Amina, you should be thanking Connor. You have been living in this dump for years, embarrassing the family name. We are destined for high society. Connor's new mega project is going to make us billionaires. We are taking the $12 million Grandpa Silas left us and using it to secure the final permits. We are elevating Black excellence, and you are standing in the way of progress." "Elevating Black excellence," I repeated, staring at my sister in absolute horror. "You are letting a white con artist drain our grandfather's inheritance to build a monument to his own ego and displace people who look exactly like you, and you think that is excellence. You are delusional, Desiree." Desiree's face flushed with sudden anger. She marched over to her designer handbag, unclasped the gold hardware, and pulled out a crisp $500 bill. She crumpled it slightly and tossed it directly at my chest. It fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing by my shoes. "Go rent a cheap motel in a bad neighborhood, sister." Desiree sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Go somewhere where you actually belong. Leave the elite business to the adults. You are unemployed, evicted, and completely irrelevant." For a fraction of a second, the old conditioned response tried to take over. The urge to cry, to break down under the weight of my sister's cruelty, to pick up the money and run away in shame. But the girl who used to cry in the shadows was dead. I looked at the $500 bill on the floor, and then I looked at Connor's arrogant and smiling face. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out the thick encrypted burner phone Elias had given me. I did not break eye contact with Connor as I unlocked the screen and hit the single speed dial number. "Who are you calling?" Connor mocked, crossing his arms over his chest. "A homeless shelter." The line connected instantly. "Elias," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing loudly in the half-empty apartment. "Yes, Heir," his deep voice replied through the speaker, crisp and ready. "I need you to pull up the portfolio for Connor's real estate development firm," I instructed, watching Connor's smirk falter just a fraction. "He just acquired the Elm Street property for his Legacy Plaza project. Locate the primary holding company he is using to secure his construction loans." Connor let out a loud and theatrical laugh. "Desiree, look at your sister. She is having a psychotic break. She is pretending to run a hedge fund from her trashed living room." I ignored him, waiting for Elias to confirm. "I have the file open," Elias responded. "Shadow Creek Holdings currently provides $50 million in blind backing to his primary lender. He is using our capital to leverage his entire corporate structure." Connor stopped laughing. His arms dropped to his sides. He recognized the name Shadow Creek Holdings. Every major developer in Atlanta knew the name of the Phantom Trust that controlled the city's commercial real estate, but no one knew who owned it. "Pull it!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room. "Liquidate the $50 million backing immediately. Flag his firm for systemic risk and sever all financial ties with his holding company. Burn his credit lines to the ground. Now." "Consider it done," Elias said. The connection terminated with a soft click. I lowered the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked at Connor, whose face had gone completely rigid. Desiree looked back and forth between us, entirely confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. "You are bluffing," Connor said, his voice dropping an octave. His confident posture was suddenly stiff, his breathing shallow. "There is no way a pathetic unemployed accountant like you has a direct line to the executive proxy of Shadow Creek. You do not even know what that company is. You are just throwing out names you read in the business journal to scare me." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its prey step willingly into a trap. I did not need to say another word. The silence in the living room stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of the rain lashing against the apartment windows. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Connor let out a breath he had been holding, his arrogant smirk slowly returning to his face. He shook his head and reached for Desiree's hand. "For a second, I actually thought you were serious," Connor scoffed, turning toward the door. "Come on, Desiree, let us leave her to pack her trash." He took exactly one step forward. Then the silence of the room was violently shattered by the sharp and urgent ringing of Connor's cell phone. The sharp electronic trill of Connor's cell phone sliced through the heavy silence of my living room. He stopped mid-stride, his custom leather shoe hovering just above the hardwood floor. Annoyance flashed across his face as he reached into his tailored suit jacket, fully expecting it to be a minor contractor or a subordinate he could quickly dismiss. He glanced at the screen, and his arrogant smirk faltered just a fraction. He accepted the call, bringing the phone to his ear with a practiced corporate sigh. "Yeah, Dave, what is the emergency?" he demanded, his voice dripping with condescension. I watched in absolute silence as the color slowly drained from Connor's face. The deep fake tan he sported seemed to turn a sickly shade of ash gray in a matter of seconds. His confident posture crumbled, his shoulders slumping forward as the muffled, frantic voice on the other end of the line delivered the devastating news. "What do you mean they pulled the backing?" Connor barked, his voice cracking slightly. "That is $50 million, Dave. You cannot just lose a $50 million anchor investment. We have contracts. We break ground on Legacy Plaza in exactly 12 days. He paced frantically across my living room, kicking a trash bag full of my winter coats out of his way. Desiree lowered her iced matcha latte, her perfectly contoured face twisting in sudden confusion. "Babe, what is going on?" she asked, her voice high and whiny. Connor ignored her, pressing the phone harder against his ear. A systemic block, he repeated the words, tasting like poison on his tongue. "What the hell is a systemic block?" "Shadow Creek Holdings does not just freeze assets without a boardroom vote. Call their proxy. Call Elias right now and fix this banking glitch before I fire your entire department." He ripped the phone away from his ear and ended the call with a vicious jab of his thumb. He stood in the middle of my ruined apartment, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive shirt. He looked at me, his blue eyes wide with panic, but his ego simply refused to connect the dots. The sheer level of privilege and entitlement running through his veins made it entirely impossible for him to process that a black woman standing in a gentrifying neighborhood was the architect of his sudden financial ruin. He let out a loud, hollow laugh, running a shaking hand through his hair. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "A massive algorithmic glitch in their risk management software right when we are finalizing the land permits." He pointed a trembling finger at me. "Nice try, Amina. You heard the name Shadow Creek on the local news and thought you could play mind games with me. You almost had me for a second." "It is not a glitch, Connor," I said, my voice dead calm. "I am the system. Now get out of my apartment before I have you removed for trespassing." The mask of the civilized white savior completely shattered. His fragile ego could not handle the defiance. He marched across the room, invading my personal space, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "You think you can play corporate warfare with me?" He spat, his voice trembling with unchecked rage. "You are a 29-year-old spreadsheet monkey making an hourly wage. I build skylines. I dictate the future of this city. You are nothing but an obstacle I am about to pave over." Desiree crossed her arms, stepping up right behind him. She glared at me with pure disgust. "You are so pathetic, Amina," she sneered. "You are literally making up imaginary hedge funds to try and scare my husband because you are jealous of our success. Connor just ruined her. You want to see how the adults handle business?" Connor asked, pulling his phone back out with a vicious smile. "Let me show you how real power works. You work at Sterling and Vance Accounting, right? Marcus Vance is your CEO." He did not wait for an answer. He dialed a number from his favorites list and put the phone on speaker, holding it up between us like a weapon. The phone rang twice before a smooth, professional voice answered. "Connor, my man," the voice of my CEO chimed through the speaker. "We still on for golf at East Lake this Tuesday." Connor smiled a cold, reptilian grin. "Actually, Marcus, I am calling about a serious security issue at your firm. It concerns one of your mid-level auditors, Amina Reynolds. She is my sister-in-law, and she is currently exhibiting highly erratic, possibly criminal behavior involving corporate espionage and financial threats against my development firm. As your friend and a major player in the Atlanta real estate market, I strongly advise you to handle this liability immediately before my legal team gets involved." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Marcus sounded instantly panicked. "Connor, I had no idea. I assure you, Sterling and Vance takes corporate threats extremely seriously. I will have security lock down her access credentials right now and handle her termination first thing in the morning. Consider it done." Connor ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked at me with absolute triumph. "You do not just lose your apartment today, Amina," he whispered, leaning in close. "You lose your career. You lose your reputation. Have fun living on the streets. Come on, Desiree, we are leaving." They walked out of my apartment, leaving the door wide open and my belongings scattered across the floor in black plastic bags. I did not move to pack a single item. I simply pulled my encrypted phone back out and sent a brief text to Elias telling him to purchase the building outright from Connor's lender by the end of the week. Then I went to sleep peacefully, knowing the storm I had just unleashed. The next morning, I dressed impeccably. I chose a sharp-tailored crimson power suit that radiated authority. I drove to the glass and steel corporate headquarters of Sterling and Vance, fully anticipating a quiet and predictable meeting with human resources where I would gladly hand over my badge. I did not need their meager salary anymore. I was a billionaire. But as I walked through the revolving glass doors of the grand marble lobby, I immediately heard the sound of screaming. It was not just any screaming. It was the distinct, shrill, and demanding voice of my mother echoing off the high ceilings. I stopped in my tracks. Standing in the very center of the bustling corporate lobby, blocking the main security turnstiles, were my parents, Calvin and Yvonne. They were waving their arms wildly, making an absolute spectacle in front of dozens of my arriving coworkers. And standing right next to them, looking incredibly flustered and holding a manila termination folder, was my CEO, Marcus Vance. The lobby of Sterling and Vance Accounting was a massive expanse of white marble and frosted glass. Usually it was a place of quiet professionalism, filled with accountants arriving for their shifts. Today that atmosphere was completely shattered. As soon as I walked through the heavy revolving doors, the heavy silence of dozens of staring coworkers hit me like a physical wall. Standing right in the center of the lobby, looking furious and entirely out of place, were my father Calvin and mother Yvonne. Beside them stood my chief executive officer Marcus Vance, holding a thick manila folder and looking deeply agitated. Before I could even swipe my badge to pass the glass turnstiles, my father pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He did not care about the audience. He did not care about my dignity. He only cared about protecting the white man who had married his golden child. "She is right there." My father shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls and stopping every single employee in their tracks. That is the woman who is trying to destroy our family. I stopped walking. My co-workers were whispering and pulling out their phones. I looked at Marcus, expecting my boss to intervene and move this spectacle into a private conference room. Instead, Marcus simply adjusted his expensive tie and glared at me. My father took a step forward, his face twisted in absolute rage. "She hacked my son-in-law out of sheer jealousy," Calvin announced to the entire lobby. "Connor is trying to build a magnificent real estate project, and my bitter, vindictive daughter used her accounting skills to hack his firm and illegally block his banking transactions. She is a criminal." The absurdity of his accusation was staggering. My father genuinely believed a 29-year-old accountant could sit in a cubicle and somehow digitally freeze $50 million in commercial funding. He had completely swallowed Connor's desperate lie. Connor had manipulated my parents into believing I was a malicious hacker rather than admit he was a broke fraud relying on a blind trust. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but my mother Yvonne closed the distance between us before I could speak. She marched up to me, her eyes burning with a mixture of shame and fury. "You are a disgrace to Black excellence," Yvonne hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "We gave you every opportunity, and you choose to act like a common street criminal because you cannot stand seeing your sister live a luxurious life. Connor is a good man who brings prestige to our name." He elevated Desiree. Then, without any warning, my mother raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the massive lobby. Several of my co-workers gasped. My cheek burned, but I did not flinch. I just stared at the woman who had brought me into this world, realizing she had completely sold her soul for the illusion of status. Yvonne reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a stack of legal documents. "Sign this non-disclosure agreement right now," she demanded, shoving the papers against my chest. "You are going to sign this and transfer your $50,000 savings directly to Connor to compensate him for the banking delays you caused with your computer stunt. If you refuse to give him your savings and sign this, your father is going to call the police and have you arrested for corporate espionage right here in front of your friends." I looked past my mother and locked eyes with Marcus Vance. He was the chief executive of a prestigious firm, but right now he looked like nothing more than a puppet. "Are you seriously allowing this to happen in your lobby, Marcus?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm. Marcus sighed and held up the manila folder. "Connor is a very powerful man in Atlanta real estate, Amina. He is a valued friend and a critical contact for this firm. I cannot have an employee on my payroll who engages in cybercrimes. You are officially terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items, and then you will be removed." He was firing me. After years of flawless audits and late nights, he was tossing me out just to appease his wealthy golf buddy. My parents looked incredibly satisfied. They thought they had finally broken me. They thought taking my job and threatening my small savings would force me to grovel and beg Connor for mercy. They truly believed I was helpless. I slowly reached up and wiped my cheek where my mother had struck me. I looked at the legal papers she was trying to force into my hands. I did not take them. Instead, I looked my parents dead in the eye. The sheer level of their betrayal was breathtaking, but it only fueled my focus. "You just sold your actual daughter to a con artist." I stated, my voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear clearly. "Remember this exact moment when you are begging for mercy later." I did not wait for an escort. I did not go to my desk to pack up my cheap coffee mug or my framed degrees. I simply turned around on my heel, pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors, and walked right back out into the bustling city street. I left Sterling and Vance behind forever, without shedding a single tear. I was no longer a corporate employee desperate for a paycheck. I was the silent owner of a $500 million empire, and I had real work to do. I rode straight back to Buckhead. Arriving at the skyscraper, I took the private elevator to the top floor. Elias stood waiting behind his marble desk. I looked at him, my voice completely cold. Elias opened Connor's corporate ledger. "I want to see exactly where my family's inheritance went." Elias did not hesitate. His fingers flew across the sleek glass keyboard embedded in his desk. The massive wall monitor shifted from global market trends to a labyrinth of corporate tax returns, shell company registrations, and offshore banking statements. The digital footprint of Connor's entire professional existence was laid bare before us. "Sit down," Amina Elias said, gesturing to the leather chair beside him. "This is going to make you sick." I pulled up a chair and leaned forward. My forensic accounting training immediately took over. For years, I had audited multi-million-dollar corporations, finding hidden assets and exposing embezzlement. I knew how to follow the money. I scanned the first page of Connor's primary holding company ledgers and felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. "He is completely broke," I whispered, tracing the red lines of debt cascading down the screen. "Worse than broke," Elias corrected. "He is drowning in high-interest liabilities." His last 3 development projects stalled due to supply chain issues and gross mismanagement. He has zero liquid capital. He has been surviving on his connections and his pristine country club image. I scrolled further down, digging into the collateral agreements for the massive bank loans funding Legacy Plaza. The numbers did not make sense. To secure the $300 million needed for construction, Connor would need a massive cash guarantee. I looked closer at the guarantor signatures on the primary loan documents, and my blood ran ice cold. There, staring back at me, were the digital signatures of my father Calvin and my grandmother Loretta. I turned to Elias, my stomach churning with nausea. "He used their inheritance," I said, pointing at the screen. "He did not just pool their money. He had them pledge the entire $12 million Grandpa Silas left them as the sole collateral for his corporate bank loans." Elias nodded, his expression grim. "He leveraged his privilege, Amina. He walked into your parents' house wearing a tailored suit, using his smooth-talking corporate vocabulary, and promised them entry into the Billionaire Boys Club. He knew your father was desperate for upper-class validation, and he knew your grandmother Loretta trusted anything your father endorsed. Connor completely manipulated them. If Legacy Plaza fails or defaults, your family will not just lose their inheritance. The banks will seize their homes, their retirement accounts, and everything they own to cover Connor's debts. He tied a financial noose around their necks to save himself." My hands balled into fists. My parents had just publicly humiliated me and allowed my boss to fire me, all to protect a man who was actively leading them to absolute ruin. Connor was using black wealth to fund a project that would displace a black neighborhood, all while padding his own empty pockets. But as I kept reading the loan covenants, something caught my eye. The banks required Connor to hold the title to the primary anchor land before releasing the construction funds. I pulled up the geographic surveys for Legacy Plaza. The project was massive, but its entire structural integrity relied on a specific 10-acre parcel of land right in the center of the development district. "Elias," I said, squinting at the property lines, "pull up the deed for the 10-acre anchor parcel on Elm Street, the one where my apartment building sits." Elias typed for a few seconds. The screen refreshed, displaying a highly classified property deed. The owner listed on the official county registry was not Connor or his development firm. The owner was Shadow Creek Holdings. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Connor does not own the land," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Elias smiled, a dangerous and sharp smile. "No, he does not. Shadow Creek acquired that entire 10-acre block 5 years ago under your grandfather's orders. Connor has been aggressively making lowball offers to our proxy lawyers for months, but we ignored every single one of them." "Then, how did he get the bank loans approved?" I asked. I tapped the keyboard, bringing up the bank submission files Connor had used to secure his funding. There, attached to the final page of his application, was a preliminary land use agreement bearing the forged signature of a Shadow Creek proxy representative. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the magnitude of his arrogance wash over me. He did not just manipulate my family. He forged federal land use permits. He lied to a syndicate of national banks. Connor was committing massive and systemic bank fraud. He was building his entire Legacy Plaza empire on a piece of dirt he did not even own. And he was arrogant enough to think no one would ever verify the paperwork because of his flawless reputation and his powerful friends. He just handed me the key to his destruction, I said, feeling a cold, predatory calm settle over my mind. Before Elias could respond, the private elevator chimed. A sharp-looking executive assistant stepped into the office holding a thick silver tray. She walked over to the desk and handed me a square envelope made of heavy, textured cardstock. "This just arrived for you via private courier, Ms. Reynolds," the assistant said politely before turning and heading back to the elevator. I picked up the envelope. The front was stamped with an ornate gold foil crest belonging to Connor's firm. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the contents. It was a formal invitation to the Legacy Plaza 5IP Gala. The event was scheduled for tomorrow night at a luxury rooftop venue overlooking the city. The dress code explicitly stated all-white attire. As I unfolded the thick invitation, a small yellow sticky note fluttered out and landed on the marble desk. The handwriting was full of looping cursive letters. It was from my sister, Desiree. I picked up the note and read it aloud. "We need someone to check coats at the front door. The pay is $15 an hour. Do not be late." Elias looked at the note and then looked at me, his jaw clenching in anger. "They really have no idea who they are dealing with," he said softly. I stared at the gold-foiled invitation, my reflection catching in the dark window overlooking the Atlanta skyline. They wanted me to stand in the corner like a servant and watch them celebrate my destruction. They wanted me to check their coats while they toasted to a criminal empire built on stolen land and forged documents. "I am going to that gala, Elias," I said, slipping the invitation into my pocket. "And I am going to let Connor give his big triumphant speech in front of the mayor, the investors, and his golf buddies. Call our legal team. Draft the fraud exposure files. We are going to burn his entire life to the ground, and we are going to do it in front of an audience." Elias's fingers flew across the glass keyboard, pulling up the encrypted routing numbers Connor had used to process my family's $12 million inheritance. I leaned over the marble desk, watching the digital trail of my grandfather's hard-earned money illuminate the massive wall monitor. It had not gone into escrow for the Legacy Plaza construction permits. It had not been used to secure zoning rights or hire architectural firms. The screen showed a massive web of offshore transfers and rapid, chaotic debt payments. Connor had taken the cold hard cash and immediately liquidated it to cover his own catastrophic professional failures. I watched the timestamps of the wire transfers, tracking the money second by second. $2 million went straight to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands to hide assets from the Internal Revenue Service. $4 million was instantly absorbed by a predatory private lending group to stop the impending foreclosure on his personal luxury mansion. Another $3 million was dumped into a failing shell company he had set up specifically to launder his massive gambling debts. He had bled my parents and my grandmother completely dry in less than 48 hours. They were empty. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold mixture of pity and absolute disgust. My parents had stood in a corporate lobby this morning and allowed me to be publicly fired, all to protect a man who had just stolen their entire future. They handed him the keys to their survival because he wore a nice suit and promised them a seat at the elite table. Now they were completely penniless, holding empty bank accounts, and they did not even know it yet. "We are not just pulling our backing, Elias," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. "We are going to bury him. I want every single legal trap primed and ready to snap shut by tomorrow night." Elias nodded, a sharp, predatory glint in his eyes. He opened a secure communication channel to the elite legal team on retainer for Shadow Creek Holdings. We spent the next 6 hours turning the top floor of the skyscraper into a war room. I used my forensic accounting skills to trace every single fraudulent wire transfer Connor had initiated, matching them against his falsified bank loan applications. We drafted immediate foreclosure notices for every single property he had leveraged using our phantom backing. We pulled the authentic deeds for the Elm Street property and drafted ironclad cease and desist orders, halting all construction on Legacy Plaza before a single shovel could hit the dirt. But the financial ruin was not enough. Connor had committed severe federal crimes. I instructed Elias to compile the forged land use permits, the fake signatures, and the falsified banking documents into a neat, highly encrypted digital dossier. We bypassed the local police entirely and routed the file directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We flagged it for massive wire fraud, identity theft, and systemic bank fraud. By the time the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, we had constructed a legal and financial guillotine with Connor's name carved right into the heavy steel blade. All we had to do now was let him pull the lever. The next afternoon, I prepared for the gala. Desiree had sent me a follow-up text reminding me not to be late for my shift at the coat check. She wanted me invisible, subservient, and hidden in the shadows, taking tips from the very people she was trying to impress. Instead, I walked into the most exclusive high-end boutique in Buckhead, where the doors were kept locked and clients were only seen by private appointment. Elias had set up a limitless corporate account for me. The boutique manager greeted me with a glass of vintage champagne and led me to a private fitting room lined with velvet. I told her I needed something for an all-white elite gala, and it needed to be completely devastating. The manager brought out a custom-fitted white silk gown that took my breath away. It was a masterpiece of architectural design with a plunging neckline, sharp structured shoulders, and a high slit that radiated absolute untouchable power. The silk flowed around me like liquid glass, catching the light with every subtle movement. The price tag was $25,000. I did not even blink. I slipped the gown on and looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the tired, overworked accountant who let her family walk all over her. She was not the scapegoat who shrank into the background to make everyone else feel comfortable. She was the sole inheritor of Silas Montgomery's empire. She was a billionaire chief executive officer ready to claim her absolute throne. I paired the gown with minimalist diamond drop earrings and a pair of stark white designer stilettos that echoed against the marble floor like a ticking clock. The evening of the gala arrived heavy with the humid heat of an Atlanta summer. The event was being held at the ultra-exclusive Pinecrest Country Club, a venue notorious for its steep membership fees and historically exclusionary elite clientele. Connor had rented out the entire grand ballroom to celebrate the launch of his fraudulent mega-project. I did not take a rideshare, and I certainly did not arrive at the service entrance in a cheap uniform. Elias had arranged for a chauffeured pearl-white Maybach to match the strict theme of the evening. I sat in the spacious leather-back seat feeling the quiet hum of the powerful engine as we glided through the towering iron gates of the country club. The long, winding driveway was lined with luxury European cars and frantic valet attendants rushing to open doors for the city's wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites. Through the tinted windows, I could see the warm glow of crystal chandeliers spilling out onto the manicured green lawns. A plush red carpet stretched from the valet drop-off all the way up the wide marble stairs to the massive double doors of the ballroom. I knew exactly what was waiting inside. Connor would be standing at the center of the room giving a triumphant, charismatic speech about his visionary leadership and urban renewal. Desiree would be hanging on his arm, dripping in jewels, bought with stolen money, posing for local society photographers. My parents would be standing right behind them, beaming with pride, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire lives had been financially destroyed, and that federal agents were currently reviewing the dossier that would end it all. The Maybach pulled smoothly up to the red carpet, bypassing a long line of waiting vehicles. The head valet rushed forward, his eyes widening at the luxury vehicle, and pulled open my door. I placed my white stiletto on the pavement and stepped out into the humid night air, ready to crash the most exclusive event in the city and watch my family's beautiful illusion burn to ashes. I walked past the stunned valet attendants without a single glance back. The heavy glass doors of the Pinecrest Country Club swung open as I approached, and the cool air conditioning washed over my skin. The grand ballroom was a sea of blinding white. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant glow over hundreds of Atlanta's most influential people. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos drifted through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Towering arrangements of white orchids framed the room, and massive ice sculptures bearing the logo of Connor's firm melted slowly under the stage lights. It was a monument to his ego entirely funded by stolen money and forged documents. I moved through the room with a slow, deliberate grace. My custom silk gown caught the light, drawing eyes from every corner. The whispers started almost immediately. People did not know who I was, but they recognized absolute power when they saw it. I walked with the posture of a woman who owned the building, because in a very real legal sense, I did. It took less than a minute for my family to notice the disruption in their perfect evening. I saw them standing near the center stage. My father Calvin had a glass of scotch frozen halfway to his mouth. My mother Yvonne looked like she was going to pass out. Her eyes darted from my diamond drop earrings down to my designer stilettos, trying to process how the daughter she had publicly slapped and humiliated yesterday was now commanding the attention of the entire room. They expected me to be broken and begging for my job back. They never expected me to walk into their elite sanctuary looking like royalty. Before my parents could take a step, my sister Desiree broke away from the crowd and marched directly toward me. Her face was flushed dark red with absolute fury. She wore a trendy white lace dress that suddenly looked cheap and poorly tailored next to my custom silk. She grabbed my bare arm, trying to pull me toward the service hallway, but I planted my feet and effortlessly shoved her hand away. "Are you crazy?" Desiree hissed, her voice trembling with panic and rage. "You cannot rent a dress and pretend you belong here. Connor's elite investors are here tonight. You are going to ruin his launch. You were supposed to be at the coat check." I looked at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but cold pity. She was completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging over her head. I did not even have a chance to answer her before the sharp thud of a wooden cane hit the marble floor beside us. My grandmother Loretta stepped up to me. Her face was twisted into a vicious sneer. She had always worshipped proximity to whiteness and wealth, and Connor was her golden ticket. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a toxic whisper so the surrounding wealthy guests would not hear her true nature. "Get out before you ruin our reputation with these investors," Loretta demanded, tapping her cane aggressively against my shoe. "You are nothing. You are a bitter, unemployed girl who cannot stand to see her sister win. We finally have a seat at the table, and I will not let you destroy our legacy." Her words were meant to break me, but they only confirmed exactly why I had to do this. My grandmother had willingly signed away my grandfather Silas and his entire $12 million fortune to buy her way into a room full of strangers who did not even respect her. She was calling me nothing while standing on the precipice of total bankruptcy. She had handed her entire life over to a con artist. I looked down at her and smiled a cold, hollow smile. I reached out and took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "I am exactly where I belong." "Grandmother," I said, taking a slow sip. "You just do not realize what table you are actually sitting at." Before Loretta could formulate another insult, the crowd parted slightly. Connor was making his way toward us. He had that arrogant, confident stride of a man who believed his own lies. Walking right beside him was an older, wealthy white man with silver hair and a meticulously tailored suit. I recognized him immediately from the massive dossier Elias and I had compiled earlier that afternoon. He was Arthur Sterling, the lead billionaire investor who was providing the secondary funding for the early stages of Legacy Plaza. He was the man Connor desperately needed to impress tonight. Connor stopped in front of me, his charming smile slipping for just a fraction of a second when he took in my appearance. He had expected to see me in a cheap uniform, hanging up coats, not wearing a $25,000 masterpiece. He quickly recovered, wrapping an arm around Desiree and pulling her close to project the image of a flawless power couple. He looked at Arthur and gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Arthur, this is my wife's estranged sister, Amina." Connor said, his voice dripping with condescension and fake sympathy. "She is going through a bit of a rough patch right now. She is currently unemployed and clearly struggling with reality, but we always try to support family even when they act out." He thought he had won. He thought he could humiliate me in front of the very man whose money he was trying to steal. Arthur Sterling looked at me with mild, polite curiosity. He raised his champagne glass in a silent greeting, waiting to see how the unstable sister would react to such a generous introduction. I did not shrink back. I did not look at the floor in shame. I looked Connor dead in the eye, watching the false confidence radiating from his posture, and then turned my gaze directly to the billionaire investor. I raised my own glass and gently clinked it against Arthur's. The delicate chime of the crystal cut through the heavy tension of the ballroom. Actually, Arthur, I said, my voice perfectly clear and carrying just enough for everyone in our immediate circle to hear. I am not unemployed. I am his landlord. Arthur Sterling froze with his champagne glass hovering inches from his lips. The polite smile vanished from his face, replaced by the sharp, calculating look of a man who had built a $1 billion empire by spotting liars. He looked from me to Connor, waiting for an explanation. Connor let out a booming, forced laugh that echoed too loudly over the string quartet playing in the background. She has always had a wild imagination, Arthur Connor said, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual. Amina loves a good joke, but this is hardly the time or place for her stand-up routine. Connor stepped into my personal space, his smile looking more like a snarl. His large hand clamped down hard around my bare arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin as he tried to physically pivot me away from the billionaire. "Let us get you a glass of water, Amina, and find you a quiet place to sit down," Connor muttered through gritted teeth. "You are clearly confused and causing a scene." I did not let him move me a single inch. I planted my heels and snapped my arm in a sharp downward twist. It was a simple self-defense maneuver, but it completely broke his aggressive grip. Connor stumbled forward slightly, his hands swiping empty air. I smoothed the silk of my gown and stepped closer to Arthur Sterling, completely ignoring Connor. "If you are finalizing the secondary funding for Legacy Plaza, you might want to ask your legal team to look a little closer at the Elm Street anchor parcel," I said, my voice steady and conversational. "Specifically, you should ask them to verify the signature on the preliminary land use agreement. Shadow Creek Holdings never signed over the zoning rights. There is a massive discrepancy in the permits. Arthur and you are about to finance a project built on forged federal documents." The blood completely drained from Connor's face. He looked like he had just been struck by lightning. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Arthur slowly lowered his champagne glass. The billionaire did not look at Connor right away. He kept his eyes locked on me, studying my demeanor, my $25,000 gown, and the absolute certainty radiating from my posture. Men like Arthur Sterling did not become billionaires by ignoring direct warnings about their investments. "Is that so?" Arthur asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A discrepancy in the zoning permits." Connor finally found his voice, panic bleeding into his tone. "Arthur, do not listen to her. She is bitter and unstable. She was just fired from her accounting firm for cybercrimes. She has absolutely no idea what she is talking about. The paperwork is flawless. I personally oversaw the escrow transfers yesterday." Arthur finally turned his gaze to Connor, and the billionaire's eyes were as cold as ice. "I do not care about her employment status, Connor," Arthur stated flatly. "I care about the deed to the Elm Street parcel. My legal team flagged a slight delay in the title transfer yesterday morning. You assured me it was a clerical error at the county office. Are you telling me you do not hold the clear title to the anchor land?" "I am telling you she is lying." Connor stammered, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "I own the land. The permits are filed. The project is completely green-lit. Then you will not mind if I make a quick phone call to my compliance officers right now to verify the Shadow Creek signature," Arthur replied, pulling a sleek black phone from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Connor was visibly panicking now. His flawless country club image was shattering in real time. He looked around the ballroom, desperately searching for a lifeline. His eyes locked onto my father Calvin, who was standing a few feet away with my mother and grandmother. Connor shot my father a look of absolute sheer terror, signaling him to do anything to break up the interrogation. Calvin saw the panic on his golden son-in-law's face. My father knew that his entire $12 million inheritance was tied up in Connor's promises. He did not know about the forged documents, but he knew that if Connor lost Arthur Sterling's backing, the whole family would face financial ruin. Calvin moved with surprising speed. He abandoned his drink on a passing waiter's tray and practically sprinted toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. Arthur was dialing his compliance team, his back half turned to Connor. Connor was wiping sweat from his upper lip, looking like a cornered animal. Suddenly, the heavy feedback of a microphone echoed through the grand ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned their attention toward the stage. My father Calvin stood directly under the spotlight, gripping the microphone stand with both hands. He forced a massive, jovial smile onto his face, projecting his voice to reach every corner of the vast room. "Excuse me, everyone, excuse me," Calvin boomed into the microphone, his voice overly loud and desperate. "I know we are all enjoying this magnificent evening, but I simply cannot let another moment pass without raising a glass to the man of the hour." Arthur paused his phone call, glancing up at the stage with a look of mild irritation. Connor let out a quiet breath of relief, using the distraction to step away from the billionaire. "I am Calvin Montgomery," Calvin announced to the crowd, gesturing grandly toward where Connor was standing. "And I am beyond honored to stand here tonight and speak about my incredible son-in-law, Connor. He is not just a visionary developer building a new future for Atlanta. He is the absolute savior of our family legacy. He is taking our heritage and elevating it to heights we never dreamed possible. Please, everyone, raise your glasses to a man of true integrity." The ballroom erupted into polite applause. Waiters hurried through the crowd, topping off champagne flutes. Desiree beamed, looking up at Connor with adoring eyes. Grandma Loretta nodded in fierce agreement, tapping her cane in approval. They were all completely buying into the illusion, clapping for a man who had already drained their bank accounts and pledged their homes as collateral for a ghost project. Arthur Sterling was not clapping. He was staring at Connor with a look of deep suspicion, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand. I did not stay to listen to the rest of my father's embarrassing speech. The distraction was exactly what I needed. I backed away from the group, slipping seamlessly through the crowd of applauding guests. I looked across the room and caught the eye of Elias, who was leaning against a marble pillar near the exit. He gave me a single sharp nod. The trap was set. The federal agents had the files. The lead investor knew about the forged signatures. It was time to pull the curtain down on the entire show. I turned away from the stage, ignoring my family's desperate performance, and began moving deliberately toward the audio-visual control booth at the back of the ballroom. The audio-visual control booth was situated on a raised platform, tucked behind heavy velvet drapery at the rear of the grand ballroom. I slipped through the shadows, moving silently in my white silk gown. A single technician sat behind a massive soundboard, monitoring the lighting cues and microphone feeds. I approached him with a calm, authoritative smile and handed him a crisp $100 bill. I leaned in close, murmuring that the guest of honor had a surprise visual presentation, and I needed to connect my tablet to the master projector line. The technician barely glanced at me before nodding and stepping aside. He handed me the direct feed cable. I plugged it into my tablet, queuing up the highly encrypted dossier Elias and I had spent the afternoon building. I kept my finger hovering just millimeters above the execution command. Down on the stage, my father finished his fawning introduction. He handed the microphone back to Connor and stepped aside, clapping enthusiastically. The crowd erupted into a fresh wave of polite applause. Connor beamed, soaking in the validation like a sponge. He adjusted his expensive tie and signaled to the lighting crew. The crystal chandeliers above us slowly dimmed, casting the room into dramatic shadows. A single bright spotlight illuminated a massive object in the center of the stage, covered by a pristine white silk sheet. With a theatrical flourish, Connor grabbed the edge of the fabric and pulled. The sheet cascaded to the floor, revealing a breathtaking scale model of Legacy Plaza. Miniature glass skyscrapers, luxury retail pavilions, and manicured green parks glowed from within. It was a beautiful, glittering lie. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of Atlanta," Connor announced, his voice smooth and dripping with false humility. "This city has given me so much, and Legacy Plaza is my way of giving back. What you see before you is a $500 million vision built on a foundation of community and progress. But vision requires action. It requires the relentless pursuit of prime real estate. I am proud to announce tonight that as of yesterday morning, my firm has officially secured the title to the 10-acre anchor parcel on Elm Street, making this dream an absolute reality. The ballroom filled with applause. Investors nodded in approval. Desiree clapped her hands together, looking at her husband like he was a god. I did not wait another second. I tapped the execution command on my tablet and stepped out from the shadows of the control booth. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, my white stilettos clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. As I moved, the massive digital screens flanking the stage behind Connor flickered abruptly. The looping promotional videos of Legacy Plaza vanished in an instant. In their place, a towering high-definition image of a classified federal property deed materialized. The red and gold seals of the county registry were magnified massively for everyone to see. Connor turned around, confusion flashing across his handsome face as he looked up at the giant screens. A murmur of confusion rippled through the wealthy audience. I reached the steps of the stage and ascended gracefully, my $25,000 gown trailing behind me like a phantom of retribution. I walked right up to the podium, reaching out and smoothly taking the microphone from Connor's suddenly rigid grip. He was too stunned to resist. He just stared at me, his jaw slack. I turned to face the sea of elite investors, politicians, and my horrified family. The room was dead silent. Every eye was locked on the massive deed displayed behind me, and then on the woman standing confidently at the center of the stage. "Connor claims he owns this land," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear across the grand ballroom. I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the room. I looked down into the front row, locking eyes directly with Arthur Sterling. The billionaire investor was staring at me with laser focus. But as the sole executive of Shadow Creek Holdings, I can assure you he does not. I continued, projecting my voice with absolute authority. He forged my grandfather's signature. The collective gasp from the crowd was a physical wave of sound. Champagne glasses clinked nervously as people shifted in shock. Arthur Sterling's face turned to stone, his eyes darting from me to the forged document highlighted on the screen. My mother, Yvonne, let out a strangled cry, grabbing my father's arm to steady herself. Desiree looked as if the floor had just dropped out from under her feet, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer terror. Grandma Loretta sat frozen, her wooden cane slipping from her grasp and clattering loudly against the floor. Connor's charming facade completely shattered. The veins in his neck bulged and his face flushed a deep, dangerous red. His perfectly manicured image dissolved into pure panic. "She is lying," Connor screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and rage as he lunged toward me. "This is a setup. She is a bitter fired employee. Turn those screens off. Turn them off right now." He frantically waved at the control booth, sweat pouring down his face, destroying his tailored collar. He reached out aggressively, trying to snatch the microphone back from my hand to silence me. I did not back away. I simply took a half step back, raised my tablet, and pressed the second button. The massive screens behind me shifted again. The property deed shrank to the corner, making way for a chaotic scrolling waterfall of raw financial data. Millions of dollars in offshore routing transfers, predatory lending agreements, and catastrophic debt statements cascaded down the digital displays in bright glowing text. Every hidden failure, every squandered dollar, and every desperate loan was laid bare for the elite of Atlanta to see. The red numbers glowed like a warning beacon across the faces of every person in the room. The scrolling lines of debt and offshore transfers were undeniable. I stood at the podium, looking down at the absolute silence that had suffocated the grand ballroom. Connor was completely paralyzed. His mouth hung open, but he had no lies left to spin. But I was not finished. This was the moment I had waited for. The moment that would finally sever the parasite from my family for good. I tapped the screen of my tablet one more time. The cascading numbers faded away, replaced by a single high-resolution scan of a master collateral agreement. The document bore the official seal of the State Banking Commission. "Connor told you all that he built this project with his own genius," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm through the speakers. "He told my family that he was elevating our legacy, but Connor does not build. He extracts. He is a black hole wrapped in an expensive suit." I pointed to the massive screen behind me. What you are looking at is the collateral agreement for the bridge loan Connor desperately needed to keep up appearances before tonight. The loan he needed to trick the rest of you into giving him your money. And to secure that loan, he did not use his own assets because he has none. A collective murmur rolled through the crowd. My father, Calvin, took a hesitant step forward, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was staring at the screen, trying to decipher the legal jargon. I saved him the trouble. He used my family, I announced, looking directly at my parents. He forged the executive authorization and signed over my grandfather Silas' entire $12 million estate. The trust fund, the stock portfolios, and the deeds to every single property my family owns. My mother Yvonne let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. Her knees seemed to give out, and she leaned heavily against my grandmother Loretta. Loretta, for her part, looked like she had been turned to stone. The cane she relied on was forgotten on the floor. Her obsession with proximity to power and wealth had just cost her everything she had ever owned. Every sacrifice my grandfather made had been wiped out by a single forged signature. Connor used the Montgomery family fortune as chips at a casino. I continued, my voice unwavering. And he lost it all. He is completely insolvent. If this project fails, my family loses everything. And if you invest with him tonight, you are tying your money to a sinking ship built on federal fraud. Arthur Sterling had heard enough. The billionaire investor did not scream or shout. Men with his level of power rarely needed to raise their voices. He simply turned his back on the stage. His face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. Arthur snapped his fingers, and his entire entourage of legal aides and security personnel immediately fell into step behind him. Arthur Connor pleaded, his voice cracking, as he scrambled down the steps of the stage, reaching out with a trembling hand. Arthur, please wait. I can explain the leverage. It is a temporary liquidity issue. I have the margins worked out. Please do not leave. Arthur did not even break his stride. He pulled his phone to his ear, his voice carrying clearly in the dead quiet of the ballroom. Freeze every asset connected to Connor Sterling, he barked into the receiver. Call the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Division. I want my initial earnest money traced and returned by morning. If he spent a single dime of it, I want him in federal prison before the weekend. The sheer finality of Arthur's words hit the room like a shockwave. The remaining investors, who had been sipping champagne and nodding at Connor just minutes ago, were suddenly scrambling for the exits. It was a mass exodus of wealth. People were pulling out their phones, making frantic calls to their own financial managers and legal teams, demanding that any association with Connor or Legacy Plaza be immediately severed. They realized they had almost been the marks in a massive confidence game. They had been used as props to legitimize a fraud. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was emptying out. The waiters had stopped serving. The string quartet was packing up their instruments. The entire glittering illusion of Connor's empire was dissolving into nothing but empty space and melted ice sculptures. The grand launch event had turned into a crime scene waiting to happen. I stood on the stage watching the destruction I had unleashed. I felt a profound sense of justice. The weight that I had been carrying since the moment I discovered the missing funds finally lifted off my shoulders. Connor was left standing alone near the bottom of the stage steps. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled. His designer suit was soaked in nervous sweat. He was watching the billionaires walk away, taking his entire future with them. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely exposed. He was nothing without the money of other people to hide behind. Then a movement caught my eye. My sister Desiree was walking slowly toward him. Her trendy white lace dress seemed to hang off her frame. She looked like a ghost. She was trembling so violently that I could see it from the stage. She stopped a few feet away from the man she had worshipped, the man she had thrown me away for. Connor. She whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the retreating crowd. She looked up at the massive screen still displaying the collateral agreement. Her eyes scanned the forged signatures and the listed properties, taking in the undeniable proof that her entire marriage was built on theft. Tell me it is a mistake, Desiree said, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her perfect makeup. Tell me Amina manipulated those documents. Tell me you did not do this. Connor could not look her in the eye. He stared at the marble floor, his jaw working silently. His breathing was heavy and ragged. Connor, look at me. Desiree screamed, her voice cracking with a raw, agonizing desperation that echoed off the high ceilings. Is it true? Did you mortgage my parents' house? Did you throw away everything we have? Connor slowly lifted his head. The charming, charismatic mask he had worn for years was completely gone. It had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. In its place was a cornered, vicious animal. He looked at his wife not with love or regret, but with pure, unadulterated contempt. Connor's face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. He did not look like the polished country club prince anymore. He looked like a cornered rat. The silence in the ballroom was absolute save for the sound of his heavy, ragged breathing. Desiree stood there shivering in her white lace dress, waiting for him to deny it. She was practically begging him to tell her it was a misunderstanding, to wrap his arms around her and protect her from the nightmare. Instead, Connor let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was a cruel, ugly sound that echoed off the marble pillars. Did I mortgage your parents' house? Connor mocked, his voice dripping with venom. Of course I did, Desiree. What did you think funded your pathetic little influencer lifestyle? Did you really believe your social media posts were paying for the private jets and the designer bags? I paid for it. I paid for all of it with the money your idiot family practically handed to me on a silver platter. Desiree recoiled as if he had physically struck her. She wrapped her arms around her own stomach, letting out a small, broken sob. My mother Yvonne buried her face in her hands, weeping openly, while my grandmother Loretta just stared at Connor with wide, horrified eyes. The man she had worshipped, the man she had sold out her own granddaughter for, was looking at them like they were dirt on his shoe. You people make me sick, Connor spat, stepping toward my father Calvin. You are nothing without me. You were so desperate to sit at the big table. You were so desperate for validation that you threw your daughter at the first wealthy white man who smiled at you. I gave you status. I elevated this pathetic family. Before me, you were just a bunch of loud social climbers pretending to be elite. I brought you into rooms you would not have even been allowed to clean. The sheer racism and classist entitlement poured out of him like toxic sludge. It was breathtaking in its cruelty. This was the real Connor. This was the man who had sat at our dinner table eating my grandfather's food and secretly plotting to steal his legacy. He had viewed my family not as equals, but as easy targets who were blinded by their own obsession with appearances. My father stood frozen, listening to the man he had called a son rip his dignity to shreds. Calvin's chest heaved, but he could not find the words to defend himself. He knew deep down that Connor was right about their vanity. They had wanted the proximity to whiteness and perceived generational wealth so badly that they had ignored every red flag. You want the truth, Desiree, Connor yelled, turning back to his trembling wife. You want to know why I married you. It was never about love. It was a business transaction. I knew old man Silas had millions locked away, and I knew his heirs were too stupid and too vain to protect it. I needed capital, and your family was the easiest mark I had ever seen. You were so obsessed with showing me off to your little country club friends that you blindly signed every piece of paper I put in front of you. You did not even read the collateral agreements. You just wanted to pretend you belonged to my world. He laughed again, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. You are all so incredibly gullible. You handed me $12 million just so you could take pictures with me at charity galas. The devastation on my family's faces was absolute. Every lie they had told themselves, every justification they had made for cutting me out of my grandfather's will, had just blown up in their faces. They had traded their loyal, capable daughter for a racist con artist who despised them. Calvin finally snapped out of his shock. The realization of what he had done of the daughter he had sacrificed for this monster seemed to strike him with physical force. He looked at me standing calmly on the stage, holding the remote that had exposed the truth, and then he looked back at Connor. A guttural roar tore from my father's throat. It was a sound of pure primal grief and rage. Calvin lunged at Connor, pulling his arm back to deliver a devastating punch. But my father was an older man running on blind emotion, and Connor was younger and desperate. Connor easily dodged the clumsy swing. He shoved his hands hard against my father's chest, sending Calvin stumbling backward. My father lost his footing on the slick marble floor and crashed down hard against the edge of a catering table. Glass shattered as champagne flutes rained down around him. Yvonne screamed, rushing to her husband's side. Desiree fell to her knees beside them, crying hysterically. Loretta just stood there, leaning heavily on her cane, looking at the wreckage of the family she had tried to control. Connor sneered at them lying on the floor. "Look at you," he scoffed, backing away toward the service exit. "Pathetic to the very end. You can keep the worthless land. I am leaving." He turned around, expecting to make a clean escape into the Atlanta night, but he stopped dead in his tracks, faintly at first, and then growing rapidly louder. The sound of sirens pierced the quiet evening air. The high-pitched wail of police cruisers and federal vehicles echoed through the perfectly manicured grounds of the Pinecrest Country Club. Red and blue lights began to flash through the massive glass windows of the grand ballroom, casting strange dancing shadows across the ceiling. I stood on the stage looking down at Connor's paralyzed form. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I had told Elias to make the call the moment the forged deeds hit the projector screen. The federal authorities had been tracking the offshore transfers all afternoon, and now they had the suspect cornered in a room full of witnesses. Connor slowly turned his head to look back at me. The arrogant sneer was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man who realized his life was over. I simply smiled, holding my chin high. The white savior mask had fallen, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom flew open with a force that rattled the crystal chandeliers above us. Dozens of uniformed police officers and federal agents in dark tactical windbreakers stormed into the pristine white room. Their heavy boots trampled over the white rose petals that had been scattered across the entrance. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers outside illuminated the terrified faces of Atlanta's elite. The music had stopped completely. The only sound in the cavernous space was the sharp, authoritative commands of law enforcement securing the perimeter. Elias walked in right behind the lead federal agent, holding the thick leather binder containing every shred of evidence we had compiled. He looked up at me on the stage and gave a small, satisfied nod. We had done it. We had brought the monster down in front of everyone he ever tried to impress. Connor stood frozen at the bottom of the stage steps. He watched the agents march directly toward him with a look of pure disbelief. He was a man who had spent his entire life believing his skin color, his tailored suits, and his smooth words made him untouchable. He honestly believed he would never face the consequences of his actions. Even as the lead agent stepped firmly into his personal space, Connor tried to put the mask back on. "Officers, there must be some kind of misunderstanding here," Connor stammered, wiping the nervous sweat from his brow and forcing a weak, charming smile. "I am Connor Sterling. This is a private corporate event. I am sure whatever this is about my legal team can clear it up in the morning." The lead agent did not smile. He did not blink. He reached to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Connor Sterling, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, forgery, and grand larceny," the agent announced, his deep voice echoing across the silent ballroom. "You are also being charged with attempting to defraud a federally insured financial institution. Put your hands behind your back." The reality of the situation finally pierced through Connor's thick skull. The charming smile vanished. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into a table of champagne glasses. "No, wait. You cannot do this to me," Connor pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I am a developer. I am building Legacy Plaza. Arthur, please tell them who I am." He looked frantically around the room, searching for Arthur Sterling, but the billionaire had already vanished out a side door, taking his money and his protection with him. Connor was completely alone. The agent grabbed Connor by the shoulder, spinning him around roughly. Connor let out a sharp gasp of shock as his arms were wrenched behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The golden boy of the Montgomery family, the man my parents had practically worshipped, was being treated exactly like the common criminal he was. Desiree suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. Seeing her husband, her ticket to high society, being handcuffed in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta broke whatever fragile grip she still had on reality. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and lunged forward. She grabbed the federal agent by the sleeve of his windbreaker, pulling at him with wild, desperate energy. "Get your hands off my husband!" Desiree shrieked, tears and black mascara streaming down her face. "You cannot do this to him. Do you know who we are? Do you know how much this dress costs? You are ruining our launch party. Take those off him right now." The agent stepped back, breaking her grip with a firm sweep of his arm. He looked at my sister with an expression of absolute stone-cold professional disdain. "Ma, I suggest you step back and calm down," the agent warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "You are currently interfering with a federal arrest, and considering your signature is on the co-signing documents for the fraudulent escrow accounts used to secure the Elm Street loans, I would highly advise you to secure a criminal defense attorney. You are currently under active federal investigation for conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Desiree stopped screaming instantly. The air rushed out of her lungs in a sharp, violent gasp. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and sickly under the bright ballroom lights. She looked down at her own trembling hands, realizing that her blind devotion to Connor, her absolute desperation to be a wealthy socialite, had tied her legally to his crimes. She was not just losing her husband and her status. She was facing federal prison. Her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the cold marble floor, weeping into her hands. My parents, Calvin and Yvonne, stood entirely frozen nearby. They watched their beautiful youngest daughter sobbing on the ground and their perfect son-in-law being dragged toward the exit by federal agents. They made no move to help either of them. The shame and the public humiliation had completely paralyzed them. The elite guests, the people my parents had sacrificed me to impress, were actively backing away from them, whispering behind their hands and recording the entire spectacle on their phones. The Montgomery family name was officially ruined. Connor was dragged down the main aisle, kicking and dragging his expensive shoes across the floor. He was crying now loudly and openly, begging the agents to let him call his lawyer, whining that the handcuffs were too tight. The wealthy crowd parted like the Red Sea, giving him a wide berth, looking at him with open revulsion. The doors closed behind him, cutting off his pathetic sobs. The remaining guests did not stay to offer condolences. They practically stampeded toward the valet exits, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the evening. Within 10 minutes, the massive grand ballroom was entirely empty, save for the melting ice sculptures, the abandoned champagne glasses, and my broken family. I slowly descended the stairs of the stage, the soft silk of my gown brushing against the steps. I looked at the wreckage of my family's ambition. My father was staring blankly at the wall. My mother was kneeling next to Desiree, patting her back with trembling hands. Then I heard the slow, deliberate tapping of a wooden cane. Grandma Loretta stepped out from the shadows of a massive floral arrangement. Her posture, which was normally so rigid and commanding, was hunched and defeated. The vicious sneer she had worn just an hour ago was completely gone. She shuffled toward me, her eyes wide and wet with unshed tears. She looked past my designer gown and saw the only person left in the world who had the power and the capital to save them from total homelessness. Loretta stopped a few feet away from me. She dropped her cane, letting it clatter loudly against the marble. She reached out her wrinkled hands, shaking violently, grasping at the empty air between us. "Amina, baby," Loretta whispered, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic plea. "You have to save us. You have to save the family." The words hung in the dead air of the ruined ballroom. Loretta was looking at me with eyes so wide and desperate they looked like they might pop right out of her skull. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was too loud, too dark, and too difficult was now begging at my feet like a cornered animal. The rest of them seemed to snap out of their paralyzed shock at the sound of Loretta's cracking voice. My mother, Yvonne, scrambled up from the cold marble floor, leaving Desiree crying in a pathetic heap of white lace. My father Calvin limped over, clutching his bruised ribs where he had fallen. They swarmed the bottom of the stage, looking up at me like I was some kind of descending deity. The very same people who had violently cast me out into a thunderstorm with garbage bags were now staring at me with ravenous, desperate hope. Yvonne reached out and grabbed my hands. Her manicured fingers dug into my skin with a frantic, terrifying strength. Tears were smearing her expensive foundation, streaming down her cheeks in dark, muddy tracks, ruining her perfect socialite facade. Amina, please, Yvonne cried, her voice shrill and breaking as she pulled at my fingers. You have the money. We saw the accounts on that giant screen. You are a billionaire now. You can fix this whole mess. You can pay off the bank and make all of this go away before the news gets out. We are your parents. We are a strong Black family, and we have to stick together in times like this. You have to save the Reynolds name. I looked down at her hands clutching mine. I felt absolutely nothing. No warmth, no residual daughterly instinct, no guilt. The bond between us had been permanently severed the night they let me walk out into the cold with nothing but the clothes on my back. I violently ripped my hands out of her grasp, stepping back so she could not touch me again. Do not ever touch me, I said, my voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that made her flinch backward. Do not stand there and lecture me about being a strong Black family. Do not preach to me about sticking together. I paced slowly across the edge of the stage, looking down at all of them as they cowered. Where was this strong family loyalty when you let that snake slap me across the face in our own dining room? Where was this deep family bond when you packed my belongings in trash bags and threw me out into the freezing rain while he laughed at me? You did not care about family then. You only cared about proximity to whiteness. You only cared about the country club invitations, the charity galas, and the illusion of elite status. Calvin tried to step forward, his face pale and contorted with a sickening mix of regret and fear. Amina, we made a terrible mistake, he pleaded, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. We were blind to his true nature. He manipulated us so perfectly. He lied to us about everything. He did not manipulate you. I shot back, my voice echoing fiercely through the empty hall. He just offered you exactly what you always wanted, a shortcut to prestige without doing the actual work. You wanted to be superior so badly that you handed him the keys to the empire my grandfather bled and sweated to build. You despised me because I reminded you of the struggle. I reminded you of the dirt and the long hours and the actual labor it took to get where we were. You preferred Connor because he looked like the establishment you so desperately wanted to belong to. You traded your own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that never wanted you in the first place. Desiree was sobbing openly now, rocking back and forth on the hard floor, clutching her stomach. Amina, please, I have nothing left, she wailed, her chest heaving with every breath. He took everything from me. The feds are going to put me in prison. You have to hire me the best lawyers. You have to help us fix this. I looked at my sister, the golden child who had spent her entire existence competing with me, undermining my achievements, and ultimately stealing the company out from under me. You did not care about the Reynolds name when you let a white con man steal it, I said, my tone absolute ice. You handed him grandfather Silas' entire legacy on a silver platter just so you could play the role of the wealthy trophy wife. You signed those fraudulent bank documents because you were too lazy and too entitled to actually read the fine print. You just wanted the money to keep flowing. I am not your savior, Desiree. I am your consequence. Loretta let out a loud, tragic wail, leaning heavily on the stage steps. But the bank, she cried, pointing a trembling, gnarled finger toward the giant screen that was still glowing behind me. The state bank holds all the collateral for that massive loan. They are going to take the main estate. They are going to take the commercial properties. They will throw us out on the street by the end of the week if those margins are not met. Amina, you have to pay the debt. You have to clear the liens before they foreclose on us. I let a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The moment of absolute, total victory tasted sweeter than I could have ever imagined. I reached down and picked up my tablet, tapping the glass screen one final time. The image of the massive collateral agreement shifted. The state bank seal dissolved into pixels. In its place, the glowing emerald and gold logo of Shadow Creek Holdings materialized across the 30-foot screen, dominating the entire room. I looked back down at the pathetic group of people who shared my blood. "You still do not understand, do you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly as I watched their faces drop. "I am not going to pay the bank, Loretta." When I saw the catastrophic mess Connor had made, I knew the state bank would eventually discover the federal fraud and seize the assets. They would have auctioned off everything my grandfather built for pennies on the dollar. So my company intervened. Shadow Creek Holdings bought out the entire portfolio of your distressed debt early this morning. My father stopped breathing. His eyes darted frantically from me to the massive logo on the screen and back again as the horrifying reality finally registered in his slow brain. "I did not just acquire the debt," I explained, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. "I am the bank. I hold the primary lien on the Reynolds estate. I hold the deeds to every single commercial property you ever owned. I own every single thing you thought belonged to you." The last bit of color drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. "What? What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over her own violent trembling. "It means I am calling in the loan," I said, my smile fading into a look of absolute cold retribution. "You are completely in default across every single account. And since the collateral was originally secured through federal wire fraud, I am legally bypassing the standard 60-day grace period. I have already filed the preliminary paperwork with the county clerk's office. I am foreclosing on the Reynolds mansion. You have 48 hours to pack whatever you can carry before my security teams arrive to change the locks and throw you out." The agonizing screams of despair that erupted from my mother and sister were deafening, but they sounded like absolute music to me. 48 hours later, the sky over the Reynolds estate was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was the kind of perfect, wealthy suburb afternoon my mother used to live for. But today, the long, winding driveway was not lined with luxury cars for a garden party. It was blocked by 3 massive industrial moving trucks. The movers were relentless. They did not care about the history of the house or the crying woman on the lawn. They stripped the walls of the expensive oil paintings my mother had bragged about for years. They carried out the massive leather sofas from my father's study. The whole illusion of their grandeur was being dismantled piece by piece and boxed away into the back of rented trucks. I stood on the expansive front porch of the mansion, leaning against the white marble columns. The heavy wooden front doors were propped wide open. I watched calmly as they loaded up the remnants of a fake empire. I held the official property deed in my hand, feeling the crisp weight of the heavy paper. It was finalized. The house belonged to Shadow Creek Holdings. It belonged to me. Down on the manicured lawn, the reality of their new life was finally settling in. My father, Calvin, sat on a pile of hastily packed cardboard boxes, staring blankly at the grass. His shoulders were slumped, and he looked like a broken old man who had finally realized the cost of his vanity. He had spent his entire life trying to be the most important man in the room, and now he did not even have a room to sit in. My mother, Yvonne, was frantically arguing with one of the movers. She was trying to force him to carry a massive crystal chandelier, but he simply ignored her and walked past. Her hair was a mess, and she was wearing a simple tracksuit instead of her usual tailored dresses. She looked absolutely frantic, waving her arms and pointing at the house as if she could command the eviction to stop. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress were standing at the end of their driveways watching the spectacle. The front door swung open again and Desiree walked out. She looked entirely unrecognizable. Without Connor to fund her lifestyle and the federal agents seizing all their shared bank accounts, she had been stripped of her glamorous armor. Her designer bags were gone. Her expensive jewelry had been confiscated as evidence. She was wearing sweatpants and an old oversized shirt. She walked down the porch steps, shivering slightly in the warm air. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen from 2 days of nonstop crying. The arrogance that used to radiate from her had been completely hollowed out. She was just a scared woman who had bet her entire life on a lie. "Amina, please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. The bank froze everything. The feds took all the credit cards. We do not have anywhere to go. The hotels are turning us away because our accounts are flagged. You have a dozen empty properties in your portfolio. Just let us stay in one of the guest houses until we figure this out. You cannot just leave us on the street. We are your family." I looked down at my older sister. I remembered the night she stood in the rain and watched Connor throw my bags into the mud. I remembered the cruel smirk on her face when she told me I was a loser who deserved nothing. I reached into the pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a crisp $500 bill. I walked down the steps and stopped right in front of her. I held the money out. Desiree looked at the bill and then looked up at me with fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "This is exactly what you threw at me when you told me to disappear," I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any pity. "Take it. Go rent a motel. Good luck." Desiree let out a choked sob, taking the money with trembling fingers. She turned away completely broken, walking back toward our parents on the lawn. She looked so small as she collapsed next to our father, burying her face in her hands. That was when a sharp, heavy thud echoed across the porch. I turned to see my grandmother Loretta standing at the top of the stairs. She gripped her wooden cane so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, hateful rage. She looked down at me as if I were a monster. "You are a disgrace to this family," she hissed, her voice shaking with venom. "You stand there acting like you are some kind of righteous hero, but you are just a vindictive little girl destroying her own blood. You threw your sister to the wolves. You ruined your father. You stole the house that your grandfather worked his entire life to buy. Silas would be absolutely ashamed of you. He would look at what you are doing right now and he would be sickened by his own granddaughter." I walked slowly back up the stairs, closing the distance between me and the matriarch who had poisoned this family for decades. I stopped so close to her that I could see the deep lines of bitterness etched into her face. "You are wrong about grandfather," I said, keeping my tone completely even. "You think you knew his secrets, but you only knew the lies he let you believe to keep the peace." Loretta glared at me, gripping her cane tighter. "You do not know anything about him," she spat. "He built this legacy for us. He built it for the Reynolds name." I let out a soft, dry laugh that echoed across the empty porch. "He built the legacy, but he knew exactly what you were going to do with it," I replied. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small sealed envelope. It was yellowed with age and bore the crest of my grandfather's personal attorney. Grandfather Silas left me something else, besides the initial startup capital for Shadow Creek. He left me a letter he wrote 3 days before he died. He told me everything, Loretta. He told me how you pressured him to cut deals with corrupt politicians. He told me how you forced him to ignore his own community to chase country club status. He knew you and Calvin were going to run this empire straight into the ground because you cared more about looking rich than actually building wealth. Loretta stared at the envelope, the remaining color draining from her face. She tried to speak, but the words seemed caught in her throat. I held the letter up so she could see his distinct handwriting. "He did not leave me the money just to start a business." I continued, my voice ringing out clearly so my parents down on the lawn could hear every single word. "He gave me the capital and the instructions to buy back the debt when you inevitably squandered it. He specifically set it up so that when you and Calvin lost everything trying to impress people who hate you, I would be the one holding the safety net. He knew I was the only one in this family who actually respected the work. He wanted me to let you hit rock bottom so I could tear down the rotten foundation you built and start over the right way. Grandfather Silas is not ashamed of me, Loretta. He planned this entire thing with me before he took his last breath. I am not stealing the Reynolds legacy. I am taking it back." Loretta shook her head violently, her silver hair falling out of its perfect updo. She refused to believe the words coming out of my mouth. She pointed her trembling, wrinkled finger at me, calling me a liar, A snake, a jealous child who fabricated a letter just to justify stealing her inheritance. She screamed that Silas loved her, that he would never betray his own wife and his only son for a disrespectful granddaughter. The veins in her neck were bulging, and her face was flushed with a dangerous red hue as she desperately tried to hold on to the crumbling illusion of her perfect dynasty. I did not argue with her. I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself against her pathetic accusations. I simply looked over my shoulder and gave a slight nod toward the long black town cars parked at the end of the circular driveway. Elias stepped out of the shadows of the old oak tree. He walked up the marble steps with his usual calm, professional demeanor, his dark suit perfectly pressed. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small black digital audio recorder. He handed it to me without saying a single word. Elias had been my grandfather's most trusted confidant for decades. Silas trusted him more than his own flesh and blood, and for good reason. I held the small device in the palm of my hand. I looked at Loretta, whose eyes were locked onto the black plastic. The angry color completely drained from her face. She knew exactly what it was. It was the dictaphone Grandfather Silas used every single evening in his study to record his daily thoughts and business notes. I pressed the heavy play button and turned the volume all the way up so the sound would carry across the entire lawn. The audio hissed with a brief moment of static, followed by the heavy sound of a match striking and a deep exhale of cigar smoke. Then the booming, gravelly voice of my grandfather filled the empty porch. It was like a ghost had suddenly materialized right beside us, commanding the absolute attention of everyone present. "Loretta thinks she is building an empire." Silas' voice echoed across the lawn, heavy with exhaustion and deep sorrow. "She thinks she is elevating the Reynolds name by rubbing elbows with the elite. But she is just tearing down the house from the inside out. My son Calvin is weak. He lets those women dictate his every move. They care more about country clubs than their own blood. They care more about looking rich than actually doing the hard work it takes to build real generational wealth." The sound of his voice made everyone on the lawn freeze completely. The movers stopped carrying the heavy oak furniture. Calvin stopped breathing, staring up at the porch with wide, terrified eyes. Yvonne covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a gasp. Desiree just stared blankly at the sky, as if her mind had completely shut down. Silas took a raspy breath on the recording before continuing his final testament. "They are going to lose it all, Amina. The moment I am in the ground, they are going to squander every single dime, trying to buy the respect of white high society that secretly laughs at them behind closed doors. You have to be the one to stop it. Break them down, Amina. Teach them the value of $1. Let them lose everything so they finally understand what it means to be poor again. Only then can you rebuild this family from the ashes. You are the only one who inherited my spirit. Do not let them destroy my legacy." The recording clicked off with a sharp mechanical snap, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the wind through the massive oak trees. Loretta stared at the small black device in my hand. The absolute, undeniable truth of her dead husband's words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. All the fight, all the vicious pride and venomous arrogance that had defined her entire existence simply evaporated into the warm afternoon air. Her knees buckled beneath her. The heavy wooden cane she used to command the room slipped from her grasp and clattered loudly down the marble steps. Loretta collapsed onto the hard porch floor. She began to weep. It was not the manipulative, performative crying of my mother or the selfish whining of my sister. It was a deep, guttural wail of a woman who finally realized that her own greed had single-handedly destroyed the only thing she ever actually loved. She clawed at the marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably, begging the empty air for forgiveness. She realized that Silas saw right through her superficial obsession with high society. She realized she was the reason her son was ruined, and her granddaughters were bitter enemies. She was completely and utterly broken. I stood over her, looking down at the weeping matriarch of the Reynolds family. For years I had dreamed of this exact moment. Sitting in my tiny freezing apartment eating instant noodles, I had imagined the fiery vindication of watching her beg at my feet. But as I looked at her pathetic, crumpled form, I felt absolutely nothing. The burning rage that had kept me warm on the streets, that had fueled my 80-hour work weeks and my relentless climb to the top of the financial world, was just gone. It was replaced by a cold, empty indifference. They were strangers to me now. I handed the audio recorder back to Elias. I turned my back on my grandmother without saying another word. I walked slowly down the marble steps, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. I walked past my father, who was kneeling in the grass, staring at his hands in total defeat. I walked past my mother, who was frozen in a state of catatonic shock. I walked past Desiree, who was still clutching the crumpled $500 bill I had given her. Not a single one of them looked up at me. Not a single one of them tried to stop me or ask for mercy. They knew it was finally over. Elias opened the heavy door of my sleek black town car. I slid into the quiet, cool interior of the back seat. Elias closed the door, shutting out the sound of Loretta's weeping and the heavy thuds of the movers carrying out the last of the antique furniture. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror, asking for my destination. "Take me to Elm Street," I said softly, leaning my head back against the plush leather seat. The drive through the city felt incredibly long and yet entirely too short. I looked out the tinted windows, watching the familiar streets of Atlanta pass by. I thought about the night I was thrown out of the house. I thought about the freezing rain soaking through my thin clothes, the absolute terror of having nowhere to go and no one to call. I thought about how my family had laughed at me while Connor locked the front gate. Now Connor was sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in a maximum security prison. My parents and my sister were effectively homeless, wandering the streets with whatever fit in their pockets. The empire they tried to steal was safely locked away in my corporate portfolio. The car slowed to a halt and the driver put the vehicle in park. We were parked on the side of a busy industrial road, far away from the manicured lawns of the wealthy suburbs. I opened the door and stepped out into the humid afternoon air. Right in front of me was a massive, empty lot. It was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence and overgrown with thick weeds and tall brown grass. This was the infamous Elm Street property. This was the exact piece of land where Connor Sterling had promised to build his glorious legacy plaza. This was the dirt that had caused my family to commit federal fraud and risk their entire fortune just to impress a charming con man. It looked like absolutely nothing. Just a patch of abandoned dirt in the middle of a developing neighborhood with broken concrete and scattered debris. But to me it was everything. It was the grave of the old Reynolds family and the ultimate foundation of the new one. I walked up to the rusted fence and wrapped my fingers around the cold metal wire, looking out over the empty expanse. The past was finally dead and buried. It was time to build something that no one could ever take away from me. The drive to the maximum security federal penitentiary took exactly 2 hours. The scenery outside my tinted car windows slowly shifted from the gleaming glass towers of the city skyline to the bleak, desolate gray concrete of the prison grounds. Elias drove the town car in comfortable silence, allowing me to simply watch the world roll by. When we finally pulled through the towering iron gates, the air outside felt heavy and oppressive. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit, my heels clicking sharply against the cracked pavement. Navigating the security checkpoints was a tedious process of metal detectors and pat-downs, but I moved through it with absolute calm. The heavy steel doors locked behind me with a loud echoing metallic clank that sounded like the end of the world. The visitor room was a miserable, sterile box with peeling white walls and rows of scratched plastic chairs. A thick wall of bulletproof plexiglass divided the room right down the middle, heavily smudged with years of fingerprints and despair. I sat down in a hard plastic chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. I waited for less than 5 minutes before the heavy metal door on the other side of the glass swung open. A heavily armed guard led him into the room. "Connor Sterling," The man who used to wear $4,000 custom suits and sneer at me across my own family dining room table looked absolutely pathetic. The bright orange prison jumpsuit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, making him look small and fragile. His perfectly styled blonde hair was now thinning and greasy, clinging flatly to his skull. Deep dark circles carved hollow valleys under his eyes, giving him the appearance of a haunted, desperate ghost. The overwhelming arrogance that used to radiate from his every pore was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the frantic, twitching energy of a cornered rat. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite mine. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and picked up the heavy black plastic receiver from the wall. I slowly uncrossed my legs, reached forward, and picked up my own receiver, holding it to my ear. The static hum of the prison phone line crackled between us. He started talking immediately, not even pausing to take a breath. "Amina, you came," he said, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate relief. "I knew you would come. I knew you would understand that this is all a massive mistake." I said absolutely nothing. I just sat there and let him talk. I let him humiliate himself completely. "It is so bad in here, Amina," he rambled, leaning his forehead against the smudged glass, his breath fogging up the plastic. "The food is terrible, and it is so cold at night, and I cannot sleep because of the noise. But listen to me. I have a plan. I know what the federal prosecutors want. They want the whole network. They want the people who facilitated the fraudulent accounts. I can give them Calvin. I can give them Desiree. I have all the proof that your parents and your sister pushed me into those illegal margins. They forced me to do it, Amina. I was just a pawn in their game to steal your grandfather's legacy." I watched the nervous sweat bead on his pale forehead. I felt no pity for him. I felt no lingering anger. I felt nothing but the absolute pure satisfaction of watching a parasite finally face the devastating consequences of its own greed. "All you have to do is stand up in court next week and say I was coerced," he pleaded, his voice rising to a pathetic whine. "Just testify that my character is good and that your family manipulated me. Just 5 minutes on the stand, Amina, and the judge might reduce my sentence to 5 years instead of 20. Please, Amina, you have your company back. You have all the money you won. Please do not let them lock me in a cage for the rest of my life. I am begging you." I leaned forward slightly, pressing my face closer to the glass. "Connor," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and cold, cutting through his frantic rambling like a knife over the crackling phone line. "I did not come all the way out here to make a deal with you. I did not come here to save you. I just came here to look you in the eye and tell you that the catering bill from my grandfather's will reading has finally been paid in full." He stopped talking instantly. His mouth hung open in dumb, bewildered confusion as my words slowly registered in his panicked brain. "Oh," and I added, letting a slow, cold smirk touch the corners of my mouth. "Thank you so much for the deed to that luxury apartment building downtown. The one you tried to hide in that offshore shell company. Shadow Creek Holdings seized it legally last month. I turned the entire building into a transitional housing shelter for the community you tried to displace. We thought about naming it after you, but we decided to name it after my grandfather instead." Connor stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror, as the realization finally crashed down on him. He was never getting out. No one was coming to save him. He started to panic, pressing his trembling hands flat against the glass, crying and pleading through the phone. "Amina, please, you cannot leave me in here," he sobbed. I reached out and gently placed the black receiver back onto the metal cradle, cutting off his pathetic weeping mid-sentence. I stood up, smoothed an invisible wrinkle from my tailored trousers, and turned my back on him. I walked out of the visitor room without a single look over my shoulder, leaving him banging his fists uselessly against the soundproof glass. The drive back to the city felt like flying. When I finally walked through the double glass doors of the Shadow Creek Holdings corporate office, the atmosphere was electric and alive. The heavy, toxic weight of the past was completely gone. I stepped into my massive corner office on the 50th floor. The afternoon sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the sleek modern furniture in warm golden light. Elias was already there standing by my wide glass desk holding a tablet. He pointed to the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall. "Turn the volume up," Elias said with a rare, genuine smile spreading across his face. I picked up the remote and unmuted the television. The local news anchor was sitting at the broadcast desk with a vibrant digital graphic of the Silas Innovation Hub displayed over her shoulder. The anchor was talking passionately about the massive revitalization project that was currently transforming the abandoned Elm Street lot. She spoke about how Shadow Creek Holdings, led by CEO Amina Reynolds, had completely reclaimed her grandfather's stolen legacy and turned a symbol of corporate fraud into a beacon of hope. The anchor praised the project for bringing affordable housing, state-of-the-art tech incubators, and real economic power back to the local Black community. She called the development a masterclass in restorative justice and visionary leadership. Footage played on the screen showing the steel skeletons of the new buildings rising proudly into the Atlanta sky. I stood in the center of my beautiful office, listening to the broadcast while looking out over the sprawling skyline of the city I now commanded. Elias handed me a fresh cup of coffee and gave me a silent, respectful nod. The scapegoat of the Reynolds family was dead and gone. The empire was finally mine, and I was exactly where I was always meant to be. I sat behind my grand mahogany desk, the heavy polished wood feeling cool and solid beneath my fingertips. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the expansive office floor. The news broadcast on the television had ended hours ago, but the quiet hum of the city outside my floor-to-ceiling windows provided all the background noise I needed. The Silas Innovation Hub was moving forward beautifully. My team was handling the logistics, and Elias was managing the legal contracts. For the first time in my entire life, there was no crisis to avert, no impossible standard to meet, and no cruel comment waiting for me around the corner. The silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sharp buzzing of my personal cell phone resting on the glass coaster next to my keyboard. It vibrated twice, sliding slightly against the condensation of my water glass. I did not recognize the number flashing on the screen. I had changed my contact information months ago, ensuring that only a select few people had direct access to me. But desperation always finds a way. I picked up the phone, unlocking the screen to read the long text message. It was from my mother, Yvonne. The message was a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as a plea for mercy. She wrote that Desiree had finally been evicted from the cheap motel and was now working the night shift at a 24-hour diner just to survive. My sister, the woman who used to cry if a designer bag was out of season, was now wiping down greasy tables and serving coffee to truck drivers in the middle of the night. Yvonne detailed how my father Calvin had fallen ill, the stress of losing his status and his stolen fortune taking a severe toll on his physical health. They could not afford his medical bills. They had sold everything of value and exhausted every single favor from the few friends who had not immediately abandoned them when the federal indictments hit the news. Desiree works at a diner. Now she wrote the desperation practically dripping from the digital words. Dad is sick. We have nothing. Please, you have punished us enough. We love you. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. I waited for the familiar tightness in my chest. I waited for the guilt that used to plague me whenever I failed to make them happy. I waited for the burning anger that had kept me alive when they threw me out into the freezing rain to defend for myself. But nothing came. There was no anger left in my veins. There was no lingering sadness. There was certainly no pity for the people who had built their extravagant lives on my quiet suffering. As I read my mother's words claiming that they loved me, I felt only absolute pure indifference. It was a vast, quiet emptiness that felt remarkably like freedom. They did not love me. They never had. They loved the convenience of having a scapegoat. They loved the safety net my grandfather had forced me to become. They were only reaching out now because they had hit rock bottom and realized that the daughter they threw to the wolves was the only one who had survived the winter. My mother was not apologizing for the decades of emotional abuse. She was just begging for a handout because the consequences of her own actions were finally too heavy to carry. She thought she could just pull the family string and I would come rushing back to fix their broken lives. I let out a slow, steady breath. I did not feel the need to explain myself to her. I did not need to write a long paragraph detailing exactly why they deserved to be right where they were. I did not need to justify my peace to the people who had tried so relentlessly to destroy it. My fingers tapped rhythmically against the glass screen. I typed out a single sentence, a final response to a lifetime of disrespect. The heir is currently unavailable. I hit send. I watched the message bubble turn green, confirming it had been delivered. Then, without a single second of hesitation, I pressed the block button and deleted the contact entirely. The phone screen went dark, reflecting my own calm face back at me. It was done. The final string tethering me to the Reynolds family dysfunction was completely severed. I set the phone face down on the mahogany desk and stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I walked slowly toward the massive windows looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple as the sun finally set. Miles away, I could see the construction cranes towering over the Silas Innovation Hub, building a future that would actually matter to the people who really needed it. For so long, I had thought that wealth was measured by the size of a bank account or the square footage of a mansion. My parents had chased that empty illusion until it destroyed them. But standing here looking at the empire I had built with my own hands, I finally understood what true wealth really was. True wealth was not just the millions of dollars sitting in the Shadow Creek Holdings accounts. It was the absolute peace of mind that comes from knowing you survived the fire. It was the quiet, profound power of cutting off the poison that had infected your life and refusing to let it spread any further. It was the knowledge that you did not have to beg for a seat at a table where you were not respected, because you could simply buy the entire building and build your own crown. I thought about my grandfather Silas. I knew he would be incredibly proud of what I had done. I had not just saved his legacy from greedy hands, I had purified it. I had let the rot burn away so something beautiful and strong could grow in its place. The city lights began to flicker on one by one, pushing back the gathering darkness of the evening. I stood there in the quiet luxury of my office, watching the world light up below me. I had walked through the mud, I had survived the ultimate betrayal, and I had emerged completely untouchable. The Reynolds empire was finally clean. The sky deepened into a rich, endless twilight, and the screen slowly faded to black. The greatest lesson from Amina's journey is that true wealth is never defined by money or the approval of a toxic family. Real power comes from recognizing your own worth, cutting ties with people who constantly tear you down, and having the absolute courage to build your own legacy from scratch. You do not ever have to set yourself on fire just to keep manipulative relatives warm. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace? Please share your own survival story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering content today.